A dead man's fingers were still tangled in a horse's mane when the fog lifted enough to show what he was. No name, no papers, just a worn leather journal pressed against his ribs like the last warm thing in the world, and a blind old gelding standing guard over him, as if it understood something the sky did not. By morning, four men in black suits would ride onto Marin's land on horses worth more than her house. And what they came looking for would change everything she thought she knew about the man she buried under her husband's oak tree, and about herself. Stay with this one. Before the story moves forward, tell us where you're watching from tonight. Somewhere cold, somewhere quiet, somewhere with land that still remembers who worked it. If you've ever buried something, a person, a version of yourself, a piece of land you loved, you'll feel this one in your chest. Like the video, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and drop your city in the comments before we go back to Montana, back to the fog, back to the night Marin found something she was never supposed to find. The fog came down from the ridge the way it always did in late October, low and patient, settling into the hollows of Marin's land like something that had nowhere else to be. She had stopped noticing it years ago, the way a person stops noticing the sound of their own house settling at night. What she noticed instead, that evening, was the silence where a sound should have been. The house behind her had not seen fresh paint in a decade, its porch boards soft in places where water had found its way beneath them year after year, and the wind that moved through the pines that evening carried the particular bite of a season about to turn hard. 17 horses lived on her 40 acres, and every one of them was old, or blind, or both. She had built the place. If built was the right word for what amounted to patched fences and a barn held together with baling wire and stubbornness. After her husband's death, when the bank had taken the working half of the ranch and left her with the part nobody wanted, the part with the rocky pasture and the leaning oak and the well that ran brown in dry summers. She had turned it into something anyway. A sanctuary. The county called it on the one form she had filled out to keep the property taxes low. She called it something simpler. A place where things that had outlived their usefulness to everyone else could still be useful to her. The horses knew her footsteps by sound. That was the first sign something was wrong. When Clementine, the old paint mare with cataracts in both eyes, did not turn her head at the creak of the porch door. The mare stood rigid at the fence line, ears pinned toward the tree line, nostrils working the air. Marin followed the animal's attention out into the dark and saw nothing but fog and the black shapes of fence posts. She almost went back inside. She had a fire dying in the stove and a body that ached in places it had not ached 10 years ago, and there was no shortage of nights when the wind moved through the pines and made sounds that were not worth chasing. But something about the mare's stillness kept her boots on the porch step a moment longer, and in that moment she heard it. Not a cry, not a call for help. A low, ragged breathing, carried faint on the wind from the direction of the property line, where her land met the unclaimed timber that belonged to no one and everyone. She took the lantern. She did not take the rifle, though she would think about that decision more than once in the days that followed. The walk to the fence line took longer than it should have, her knees protesting every uneven patch of ground, the lantern lights swinging shadows across the grass. She found the horse first, a gelding she had never seen before, sway-backed and gray-muzzled, standing with the particular stillness of an animal that has decided to guard rather than flee. Its eyes were clouded white, blind the way Clementine was blind, and it did not startle at her approach. It simply stood, patient, over the shape lying in the wet grass beneath it. The man was old, older than Marin by a decade, maybe more, his face weathered into deep lines that spoke of decades spent outdoors, his clothes plain and worn in a way that told nothing of who he had been or where he had come from. His hand was pressed into the gelding's foreleg, not gripping, just resting, the way a man rests his hand on something familiar when he is running out of ways to hold onto the world. His breathing was shallow. His eyes, when they opened at the sound of her boots in the grass, were clear and unafraid. She knelt beside him. She asked if he could hear her. He nodded, barely, and his hand moved from the horse's leg to the journal tucked inside his coat, holding it the way a man holds something he has decided, finally, to let go of. "Keep her safe," he said. His voice was dry paper, barely more than breath. The horse. Keep her. Marin told him she would get help, that she had a truck, that the county hospital was 40 minutes if the roads held. He shook his head, so slightly it might have been the fog moving instead of his skull, and something in his face settled into a kind of peace she recognized because she had seen it once before on her husband's face, in the hour before he died, in the same kind of quiet. She did not leave him. She sat in the wet grass with the lantern between them and held a stranger's hand while the fog thickened and the blind horse stood watch over both of them. And somewhere in that hour, without a word passing between them beyond his ragged breathing and her own quiet assurances that he was not alone, the old man stopped breathing altogether. She sat with him a long while after that, long enough for the lantern oil to burn low, long enough for the cold to work its way into her hands and her hips and the old ache behind her sternum that had nothing to do with the weather. She thought of the county morgue, of unclaimed bodies and cheap pine boxes and unmarked plots in soil nobody visited. She thought of her husband under the oak tree, the only patch of ground on this whole 40 acres that still felt like it belonged to something larger than debt and loss. She made a decision in that hour that she would not fully understand the weight of until morning arrived on horseback. The digging took most of the night. Marin was not a young woman, and the ground beneath the oak was thick with roots that fought the shovel at every foot of depth. But there was a rhythm to grief work that her body seemed to remember from the last time she had done this, 7 years before, for a husband instead of a stranger. She did not question the labor. She simply performed it, methodically, stopping only to press a hand against the small of her back or to check on the blind gelding, who had followed her from the fence line without hesitation and now stood at the edge of the lantern light, head low, patient as stone. She wrapped the old man in a canvas tarp from the barn, the same kind she used to cover hay bales against the rain, because it was the only clean fabric large enough, and because some part of her could not bear the thought of lowering him into the earth with nothing at all between his body and the dirt. She said no formal prayer over him. She had lost the habit of formal prayer somewhere around the time the bank took the working half of the ranch, but she spoke to him anyway, low words about safe passage and about hoping wherever he had been walking from. Whatever had driven a man his age out into open country with nothing but a blind horse and a journal, that he had found what he was looking for before the end came. The journal she did not open. It sat inside her coat pocket, a small solid weight against her ribs, and every time her hand brushed against it while she worked, she felt something close to trespass. It was not hers to read. It belonged to whoever eventually came looking for him, if anyone came looking for him at all. By the time she filled the grave and pressed the last of the disturbed earth back into place beside her husband's headstone, the eastern sky had gone the color of ash, that pre-dawn gray that isn't quite morning and isn't quite night. She stood over the two mounds of earth, the old weathered one and the fresh raw one beside it, and something in her chest loosened for the first time in longer than she could remember. The particular relief of having done right by someone, even a stranger, even at cost to herself. The blind gelding pressed its nose against her shoulder. She let her hand rest against its neck, feeling the animal's slow, steady pulse, and led it toward the barn where Clementine and the others waited in the gray light, already stirring, already curious about the new addition to their strange, patched-together family. She thought, more than once during those long hours of digging, of the coroner's van that would have come for a man like this had she made a different choice, of the county's unmarked field where the unclaimed were laid without ceremony, one atop another in soil that no living hand ever tended. She thought of her husband's own funeral, small and threadbare, and of how she had promised herself then that no one buried on this land would ever again be forgotten the way the world had so nearly forgotten him. She did not sleep. There did not seem to be time for it. She fed the horses as the sun came up properly, moving through the routine with the automatic competence of habit while her mind kept circling back to the old man's face, the peace in it, the way he had said keep her like it was the only thing in the world still worth asking for. It was Clementine who alerted her the second time. The old mare's head came up sharply at a sound Marin's own ears had not yet caught. Hoofbeats, several sets, moving with the unhurried confidence of animals bred for show rather than work. Marin stepped out from the barn, wiping her hands on her jeans, and saw them coming up the long dirt track from the county road, for riders silhouetted against the rising sun, black suits beneath long dusters, horses so clean and well-muscled they looked like something out of a photograph rather than the actual gray Montana morning. She felt the cold reach of dread before she understood why. Nothing about men dressed like that belonged on a road that led only to her land and the unclaimed timber beyond it. They were not lost. They were arriving somewhere on purpose, and the only somewhere out here was her. She stood her ground at the fence line as they approached, the same fence line where she had found the old man 12 hours before, and watched the lead rider, a tall man with steel-colored hair and a face carved into permanent, careful neutrality, bring his horse to a stop close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He introduced himself as Sterling. He said he was looking for a man. He described him: the age, the build, the plain worn clothes. A journal he never traveled without, and Marin felt the blood leave her face before she had decided how she was going to answer. She told the truth, because lying had never come easily to her, and because something about this man's stillness suggested he would know a lie the moment it left her mouth. She said the man had come onto her land in the night, that he had been unwell, that he had passed before she could get him help. Sterling's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, the particular focus of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about a situation. He asked where the body was now. Marin pointed toward the oak tree, its bare branches just visible over the roofline of the barn, and watched 4 men in black suits go very quiet in a way that told her, with sudden and terrible clarity, that the stranger she had buried in the night had not been a stranger to anyone but her. Sterling dismounted without being asked to. The other 3 men stayed on their horses, watching Marin with an attention that felt less like grief and more like appraisal. And she understood, standing there in her mud-crusted boots with straw still caught in her hair, that whatever was about to happen was not going to be simple. He walked toward the oak tree with the deliberate pace of a man approaching evidence rather than a grave, and Marin followed a few steps behind, aware of every eye still on horseback tracking her movement. The fresh mound of earth sat beside her husband's weathered headstone, and Sterling stood over it for a long moment, hands clasped behind his back, jaw working slightly beneath skin gone pale despite the cold. He asked her name. She gave it. He asked how long she had lived on this land. She told him. He asked, without looking at her, whether she had searched the man's clothing before burying him, whether she had taken anything, found anything, kept anything. The accusation sat under the question like a stone under still water, visible if you looked, and Marin felt something in her spine straighten in response to it. She said she had taken nothing. She said the only thing she had was the journal, because he had been holding it when she found him, and it had felt wrong to bury a man with the one thing he seemed to have carried through to the very end. Sterling turned to face her then, and for the first time something like genuine uncertainty crossed his carefully composed features. He asked to see it. She retrieved it from inside her coat, where it had sat against her ribs through a night of digging and a morning of dread, and held it out to him. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been searching for and dreading finding in equal measure, and when his fingers finally closed around the worn leather cover, his hand was not quite steady. He did not open it in front of her. He tucked it inside his coat with a care that told Marin more about its importance than any explanation could have, and when he looked back at her, the neutrality had returned to his face, but something colder had settled beneath it. He told her that the man she had buried was named Alden Whitfield, that the name would mean nothing to her, and that was, in its way, exactly the point. That Alden Whitfield had founded and quietly funded, for the better part of 30 years, the largest rural land conservation trust in 3 states, a trust responsible for protecting working ranches, family land, and exactly the kind of forgotten, unglamorous sanctuary Marin had built out of stubbornness and grief. He told her that Whitfield had vanished from his own compound 6 weeks earlier, against the counsel of doctors who had given him considerably less time than that to live, and that every resource the trust possessed had been quietly searching for him since. That the old man had told no one where he was going or why, only that he intended to find, before he died, someone who loved land and animals for reasons that had nothing to do with money. He said the search had covered 4 counties, private investigators, discreet inquiries at hospitals and shelters, a network of ranch hands and veterinarians quietly asked to report any sighting of an old man traveling alone with a blind horse. Nothing had surfaced in 6 weeks. No motel registered him. No clinic treated him. He had simply walked out of a life built on committees and quarterly reports and disappeared into open country the way. Sterling admitted with something close to reluctant respect, he He had always said he wanted to disappear when the end finally came. One of the mounted men behind Sterling shifted in his saddle, and Marin caught the look that passed between him and the others. Not grief exactly, not yet, but the particular unease of men realizing that a quiet, humble death in a stranger's field had rendered 6 weeks of careful, expensive searching entirely beside the point. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Marin to hear her own pulse in her ears. She understood, with the slow horror of a woman watching a door close from the wrong side of it, that she had not simply buried a stranger out of kindness. She had buried the answer to a question a great many powerful people had been asking for 6 weeks, and she had buried him in secret, without documents, without a coroner, without permission from anyone. Sterling's next words confirmed the shape of the trouble settling over her like weather. He said this would need to be reported, that there were laws about the handling of remains, laws about reporting a death, laws that did not care how gentle her intentions had been. He said the trust board would need to be informed, and that among the members of that board was Whitfield's niece and sole living relative, a woman named Iris Calloway, who had spent 6 years pushing to liquidate the trust's rural holdings for development and would not, Sterling suspected, receive this news with anything resembling grief. He said all of this without cruelty, in the flat, careful voice of a man who dealt in facts because feelings were not his department, but Marin heard the warning inside it clearly enough. She had done a kind thing in the dark, alone, out of instinct and mercy, and now, in the daylight, surrounded by men on expensive horses, that kindness had become something that could be twisted, weighed, and used against her. She looked past Sterling toward the barn, where the blind gelding stood at the fence, unmoving, refusing to so much as glance toward the men who had come to claim whatever remained of the life it had once belonged to. And she understood, watching that stillness, that whatever was coming for her, the horse had already chosen its answer. Sterling lingered a moment longer than the others, his gaze moving once more toward the fresh mound of earth beneath the oak, then back toward Marin with an expression she could not yet read. He said, almost to himself, that Whitfield had not carried identification of any kind for the past 6 weeks, that even his own board did not know what he looked like anymore after the illness had taken the weight from his face, and that the only reason anyone now stood convinced of the dead man's identity was the journal itself, and the gelding that refused to leave a stranger's grave. He did not say what that meant. He mounted his horse without another word, and the 4 of them rode back down the long dirt track the way they had come, leaving Marin alone with 2 graves, 1 grieving horse, and a silence that had grown heavier rather than lighter for having been broken. The summons arrived 4 days later, delivered by a courier in a car too clean for the dirt road it had traveled, and it did not read like an invitation. Marin was to appear before the full board of the Whitfield Land Conservation Trust in Bozeman, to answer for what the document called, in language stiff enough to cut, unauthorized interment and possible concealment of a deceased person of significant public interest. She had never stood in a room like the one she found herself in that following week. High windows, a long table of dark wood, a dozen faces arranged around it with the particular blankness of people who had already decided the outcome and were merely observing the formality of the process. Sterling sat near the head of the table, journal presumably somewhere in his possession still, though he gave no sign of it. Beside him sat a woman Marin did not need to be introduced to, because everything about her, the tailored coat, the composed hostility around her mouth, the way her eyes moved over Marin's worn boots and weathered hands like she was assessing livestock, told her this was Iris Calloway. Iris did not wait for formalities. She opened by stating, for the record, that a woman with no medical or legal qualification had taken it upon herself to bury a man of considerable public and financial significance in an unmarked grave on her own property, without notifying authorities, without seeking identification, and, she paused here, letting the accusation breathe, without explaining why she had been so eager to see him in the ground so quickly. Marin felt the room's attention settle on her like weight. She could have explained the fog, the fence line, the blind horse standing guard, the particular indignity of a pauper's grave that she had wanted to spare a dying stranger. She could have explained that she had sat with him through the last hour of his life because no one else had been there to do it. Instead, she found herself doing something simpler. She told them, plainly, without embellishment, exactly what had happened, in the order it had happened, leaving nothing out and adding nothing that had not occurred. She told them about the mare's stillness that alerted her, about finding him in the wet grass, his hand on the horse's leg, about his voice, asking her to keep the horse safe, about sitting with him as he died, and the decision she made afterward, alone, at 3 in the morning, with a shovel and a canvas tarp and a grief she recognized because she had buried her own husband under that same tree 7 years before. Iris interrupted twice, each time sharpening a question into something closer to an accusation, asking why Marin had not simply called for help sooner, asking whether she had known, even suspected, who the man was and what he was worth to the people looking for him. Marin answered both without flinching, though something in her chest tightened each time, an old, familiar tightening she associated with being disbelieved by people who had never had to make a hard decision alone in the dark. It was Sterling, eventually, who spoke into the silence that followed her account. He said, in the same flat voice he had used at the oak tree, that he had reviewed the property records, the phone records, and the limited financial records available to a woman living the way Marin lived, and found nothing, no transaction, no withdrawal, no unexplained deposit, to suggest she had taken anything from Whitfield's person or attempted to profit from his death in any way. He said this simply, as a matter of fact rather than defense, and Marin watched something shift almost imperceptibly around the table, the room's certainty cracking just slightly at the edges. Iris was not finished. She raised, instead, the matter of the property itself, Marin's 40 acres, her sanctuary, her collection of blind and aging horses, and suggested that regardless of the board's findings regarding theft, the unauthorized burial constituted a legal violation serious enough to warrant civil action, action that could, given the modest resources available to a rural widow, easily result in the loss of the land in question. She said this with the practiced calm of someone who had used the machinery of law to acquire things before and intended to use it again. Marin felt the floor of her composure give slightly at that, because it was true, and everyone in the room knew it was true. She did not have the resources to fight a protracted legal battle. She had built her sanctuary on stubbornness and unpaid labor, not capital, and the trust lawyers could bury her in paperwork the same way she had buried Alden Whitfield in earth, quietly, efficiently, with no one left to object. Somewhere near the middle of the meeting, a heavy-set board member with a soft voice and softer hands asked Marin, almost gently, whether she had any family who could vouch for her character, any community standing that might speak to the sincerity of her account. She answered that she had no family left to ask, that her husband had died 7 years before and her father a decade before that, and that the only character witnesses available to her stood in a barn 40 miles away and could not speak in any language this room would recognize. A few of the board members exchanged glances at that, something shifting almost imperceptibly in the room's temperature, though Iris's expression did not soften even slightly. Iris pressed further still, asking whether Marin had considered, even briefly, the financial windfall that might come from being the one who found the missing founder, whether some part of her had recognized an opportunity in that field at 3 in the morning and acted accordingly. The question landed like a slap, and Marin felt heat rise in her face before she trusted herself to answer. She said, evenly, that she had not known who the man was, that she had not asked, that a person dying alone in the cold does not require a name before he deserves company, and that if wanting nothing in return made her foolish in the eyes of this room, she would rather be foolish than the alternative. The meeting adjourned without resolution, the board reserving judgment pending what Sterling called further review, and Marin walked out of that tall windowed room into the gray Bozeman afternoon with the distinct sensation of having survived an ambush only to be told the war was still ongoing. It was in the parking lot, loading herself into her truck with hands that had not quite stopped trembling, that she saw the blind gelding again, not physically present, of course, 40 miles from her land, but present in the memory of how it had refused, that morning 4 days earlier, to so much as look at the men who had come for it. Present in the way it had chosen to stay near her, near the fresh grave, rather than follow the horses that had arrived to claim whatever remained of its old master's legacy. She drove home through failing light with that image sitting in her chest like a small, stubborn ember, and she found herself thinking, for the first time and longer than she could remember, that perhaps she was not entirely alone in this after all. The gelding's name, she learned eventually from a groom sent to check on the animal's condition, was Ranger, and he had belonged to Alden Whitfield for 11 years, since well before the blindness set in, back when the old man still rode the trust's properties himself instead of managing them from behind a desk in a compound none of his own board members seemed to have ever visited. Marin had taken to the horse the way she took to all of her animals, slowly, without forcing familiarity, letting the creature come to trust in its own time. But Ranger had not needed time. From the first morning, he had stood near her at chores, had followed her voice around the pasture with the same unerring attention Clementine gave her, and on the second week, when a second delegation arrived from the trust, this time not Sterling, but a property assessor sent to evaluate the circumstances of the burial site, Ranger had refused, flatly and immovably, to allow the man within 10 feet of him. The assessor, a nervous younger man clearly unaccustomed to field work, had tried twice to approach the horse with a lead rope, and both times Ranger had wheeled and planted himself between the man and the direction of the oak tree, ears pinned, nostrils flared, every line of his aged body communicating a refusal that needed no translation. Marin had watched this from the porch with her arms crossed, and something in her had recognized, with startling clarity, that the horse was not merely spooked. He was guarding. He had appointed himself sentry over a grave the same way he had once, presumably, guarded a dying man in a fog-choked field, and no assessor with a clipboard was going to move him from that post. The assessor left without completing his evaluation, muttering something about returning with proper equipment, and Marin had gone to the fence afterward and stood with Ranger a long while, her hand on his neck, feeling the tension slowly leave his body as the truck's engine faded down the road. It was that same week that the second summons arrived, not from the board this time, but from Sterling directly, in the form of a phone call rather than a courier, his voice carrying a note of something Marin had not heard from him before. Urgency, maybe, or unease. He told her the journal had been fully reviewed by the trust's legal team, and that certain entries required her presence, in person, before the full board could reach any final decision about the property dispute or the burial violation. He would not say more over the phone. He asked only that she come prepared to answer questions about her late husband and about her father, two subjects Marin had not expected to hear mentioned in the same conversation as a rural land trust's legal proceedings. She spent the days before that meeting in a state she recognized from the worst stretch of her life, the months after her husband's death, when the bank's letters had started arriving weekly and every knock at the door carried the particular dread of further loss. She fed her horses. She mended fence. She sat some evenings beneath the oak tree, one hand resting on the fresh grave beside her husband's, feeling the strange, unearned intimacy of grieving two men she had known, in total, for less than a single night. Her father's name surfacing in this was the detail that would not let her sleep. She had not spoken to him in the final decade of his life, had not attended anything beyond the barest formalities of his funeral, carrying into that silence a wound she had never managed to close. The two of them had argued, badly and permanently, over the sale of his own struggling land some 30 years before, an argument that ended with him keeping the land through means Marin had never fully understood and never asked about, and with a rift between them that neither had the humility to cross before he died. She found herself, one evening that week, pulling an old cigar box down from the top shelf of her closet, the kind of box every rural household seems to keep without quite deciding to, filled with photographs gone soft at the corners and papers nobody has the heart to throw away. Inside it was a single photograph of her father standing in front of a barn that no longer existed, taken the same year the land dispute between them had opened a wound neither of them ever managed to close. She held the photograph a long while under the kitchen light, studying a face she had spent 30 years trying not to think about, and found herself wondering, for the first time, about the particular silence that had surrounded her father's finances in the years after the debt crisis nearly took their land, a silence he had never explained, and she had never asked him to. She could not imagine what a dead conservationist journal might have to do with any of that, but some old, half-buried part of her, the same part that had knelt in wet grass beside a dying stranger instead of running for help, understood before she was willing to admit it that the story was not finished revealing itself, and that whatever came next would cost her something she had not yet been asked to give. The morning of the meeting, Ranger walked to the fence line as she loaded the truck and stood watching her with a stillness that felt, for the first time, less like guarding and more like waiting, as if the horse understood, in whatever way horses understand such things, that the ground beneath all of them was about to shift. The boardroom felt smaller the second time, though nothing about it had changed except Marin's understanding of what happened inside it. She took the same chair. Sterling sat in the same place. The journal, now resting directly in front of him on the dark wood table, its leather cover worn soft at the corners from decades of a dead man's hands. Iris Calloway occupied her seat like a queen awaiting a formality, already composing, Marin suspected, the language of the motion she intended to bring the moment this meeting concluded. Sterling did not begin with pleasantries. He opened the journal to a page marked with a thin strip of ribbon and, in a voice that had lost some of its careful flatness, began to read. He read of a young rancher, 30 years past, buried under debt after 2 seasons of drought and a bank that had stopped extending patience. He read of a stranger who had purchased that rancher's mounting debts anonymously through a shell arrangement, quietly, without ever revealing his identity, asking only that the payments continue at a pace the rancher could bear, asking nothing else in return, no thanks, no acknowledgement, no name attached to the mercy at all. Marin felt something go very still and very cold in her chest, because the rancher in question, described in Whitfield's own careful handwriting by the name of his land and the county it sat in, was unmistakably her father. She heard herself ask, in a voice that did not sound entirely like her own, whether her father had ever known the name of the man who saved him. Sterling shook his head. He said the arrangement had been structured through 3 layers of legal separation specifically to prevent that knowledge from ever surfacing, that Whitfield had insisted on it personally, and that as far as the trust's own records showed, her father had gone to his grave believing his debts had simply, mysteriously, become manageable through nothing more than his own stubborn persistence. Something in Marin's chest that had been clenched for 30 years, since the last bitter argument she and her father ever had about that land, loosened without warning, and she had to press her palm flat against the cool wood of the table to keep her composure in front of a room full of strangers who had, until an hour ago, considered her a suspect. Sterling looked up from the page then, and for the first time since she had met him, his composure seemed to cost him effort to maintain. He said that Alden Whitfield had, 3 decades earlier, quietly saved her family's land from foreclosure, expecting nothing, revealing nothing, motivated by a belief he had written about at length in these pages, a belief that the people who deserved help were precisely the ones who would never think to ask for it, and that true generosity survived only in anonymity, where it could not be repaid, thanked, or turned into leverage. He read further. He read of an old man, dying, who had grown disillusioned with the very trust he had built, watching it slowly fill with board members who spoke of conservation in the language of portfolio diversification, who saw land the way Iris Calloway saw it, as an asset to be optimized rather than a thing to be loved. He read of Whitfield's final decision, made against his doctor's warnings and his lawyer's objections, to walk away from the compound and search, on his own 2 feet and his blind horse's 4. For someone who still tended land and animals for reasons that had nothing to do with money, so that he might leave the trust's future in hands that would not betray its purpose. And then Sterling read the final entry, dated the very morning of the night Marin had found him in the fog, written in a hand grown shaky with illness, but unmistakably deliberate. Whitfield had written that he did not know, yet, whether he would find what he was searching for before his body gave out. He had written that if he did not, he hoped only for a quiet end and an unmarked grave among people who had never known his name, because a man who had spent his final weeks searching for love that expected nothing in return deserved, in death, to receive exactly that kind of love, undiluted by knowledge of who he had been. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marin heard her own heartbeat again, the way she had in this same room weeks before, except now it was not fear driving the rhythm. It was something closer to grief arriving late, grief for a man she had known only in the last hour of his life, and had somehow, without either of them intending it, repaid a debt neither of them had known existed. Iris broke the silence first, her voice sharper than before, edged with something like panic beneath the composure. She said the journal proved nothing legally binding, that sentiment was not succession, that whatever anonymous kindness her uncle may have shown 3 decades ago had no bearing on the current, very real question of trust governance and the disposition of trust assets. She said the board would still need to address the burial violation, the property dispute, the entire irregular situation this woman had created through her recklessness. It was Sterling who answered her this time, and something in his voice had changed entirely. The flat neutrality replaced by the particular steadiness of a man who has finally understood which side of a line he stands on. He said that the final page of the journal, written the same night Whitfield died, contained something the board could not simply set aside. A handwritten instruction, witnessed by no lawyer because none had been present, but written in Whitfield's own unmistakable hand, stating his wish that stewardship of the trust's remaining rural holdings pass to whoever received him in his final hours without knowing who he was. Whoever showed him mercy expecting nothing, exactly the kind of person he had spent his dying weeks searching for. The room erupted into argument then, board members speaking over one another, Iris's voice rising above the rest with threats of legal challenge, of contested wills, of an old man's confused final ramblings carrying no more legal weight than a diary entry. Marin sat through all of it very still, hands folded in her lap, feeling the enormous, impossible weight of what was being described settle over her like the fog that had brought Alden Whitfield to her fence line in the first place. She had not asked for this. She had knelt in wet grass because a dying man needed company, and she had buried him beneath an oak tree because no one deserved a pauper's grave. And somewhere in the space between those two decisions she had, without ever intending it, inherited a legacy 30 years in the making, one that began with her own father's rescue and ended with her own unknowing act of the same mercy, repaid forward to a stranger who turned out never to have been a stranger at all. Iris was not done fighting. She stood, gathering her papers with hands that were not quite steady despite her composed voice, and announced that she would be retaining outside counsel to challenge the validity of the entire proceeding, that a journal entry written by a dying, possibly delusional man in his final hours held no more legal standing than a fever dream, and that she intended to see this matter through the courts for as long as it took to protect what she called the trust's fiduciary responsibility to its remaining stakeholders. She left the room without waiting for a response, her heels sharp against the hardwood floor, and the door closing behind her seemed to Marin to carry the particular finality of a war being declared rather than concluded. The board's session ended without a vote, adjourned pending what Sterling called proper legal review of the journal's final instruction, and Marin left the building that afternoon into weather that had turned, for the first time in weeks, genuinely clear, a hard blue Montana sky with none of the fog that had followed her since the night she found Whitfield in the grass. The weeks that followed were not simple. Iris Calloway filed exactly the kind of challenge Sterling had predicted, contesting the validity of an unwitnessed journal entry as any form of binding instruction, and for a while it seemed entirely possible that the entire matter would collapse into the kind of protracted legal war that would exhaust Marin's modest resources long before it exhausted the trust's considerable ones. A lawyer arrived at her gate one gray afternoon, sent by Iris's counsel, carrying an offer that Marin read twice before she understood what it actually asked of her. A modest settlement, enough to clear whatever legal costs she had accrued, in exchange for signing away any claim to stewardship and quietly stepping back from a fight the letter implied she had no real chance of winning. She stood at her own fence line reading that letter with Ranger's warm breath against her shoulder, and felt, for one long, unsteady moment, the pull of a life without lawyers, without boardrooms, without the weight of a dead man's final wish resting on her aching shoulders. She folded the letter, thanked the lawyer for his trouble, and told him she would not be signing anything until the board's process had run its proper course. He left without argument, though something in his face suggested he had expected exactly that answer and had come only because Iris insisted on trying. She spent those weeks doing the only thing she knew how to do under pressure, tending her animals, mending her fences, feeding Ranger each morning from her own hand, until the old blind gelding began nickering at the sound of her boots on the porch the same way Clementine always had. It was Sterling, in the end, who found the way through. He produced records, quiet, methodical, Exactly the kind of work Marin imagined had defined his entire career, showing that Whitfield had, in the final year of his life, consulted privately with an estate attorney outside the trust's own counsel, a woman in Helena who confirmed, under oath, that Whitfield had discussed exactly this intention months before his disappearance, a wish to identify, through whatever unconventional means necessary, a single steward who could be trusted with the rural holdings once he was gone. Someone selected not through committee or resume, but through direct, unmediated proof of character. The attorney testified that Whitfield had described his plan, roughly, as it had in fact unfolded, a search on foot and on horseback, deliberately without identification, to see who would help a stranger with nothing to offer in return. The testimony did not end the fight, but it shifted its weight decisively. Iris's challenge, built on the claim that the journal entry was the confused scribbling of a dying man, could not survive contact with an attorney's sworn account that the plan had been sane, deliberate, and consistent for months prior. The board, faced with mounting legal exposure and a membership increasingly uneasy about publicly opposing what was rapidly becoming known, through channels Marin never traced, as the story of the widow and the buried founder began to fracture along lines that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with liability. Iris did not stay to watch the vote that finally came, 6 weeks after the night in the fog. She resigned from the board before the session convened, citing, in a brief statement Marin never bothered to read in full, irreconcilable differences regarding the trust's future direction. The vote that followed her departure was neither unanimous nor especially warm. Several board members made clear, in careful language, that they considered the entire arrangement irregular and were acceding to it only because the legal risk of contesting it further outweighed whatever discomfort they felt about a rural widow inheriting stewardship of assets worth more than she could likely comprehend. But the vote passed, and with it came confirmation of Whitfield's final wish, exactly as he had written it in a shaking hand on the last page of a journal that had traveled with him through his final search. Marin did not celebrate. She drove home the evening the vote passed and went straight to the oak tree, where she sat between the two graves, her husband's, weathered and familiar, and Whitfield's, still raw enough at the edges to remind her how recently all of this had begun, and said nothing at all for a long while, simply sitting with the particular silence of a woman who has won something and does not yet know what winning costs. Ranger found her there, as he often did in the evenings now, and lowered his head until it rested against her shoulder, warm and heavy and entirely without agenda. Exactly as he had done in the boardroom parking lot weeks before when Marin had needed, more than anything, to believe that some things in the world still gave without expecting return. The legal costs of the fight, even won, were not nothing. Marin spent the better part of the following spring in Bozeman more often than she would have liked, signing documents, meeting with a small team of trust administrators who arrived with considerably more humility than the board members who had once eyed her boots with suspicion, learning the slow, unglamorous work of what it actually meant to steward land she had never asked to be responsible for. She kept her own 40 acres separate from the larger holdings, insisting, over some quiet resistance from the administrators, that her sanctuary remain hers alone, unofficial and unglamorous and exactly as patched together as it had always been. She did not become a different woman. That was, perhaps, the detail that surprised the trust staff most, expecting as they seemed to some transformation befitting a fairy tale, a widow elevated overnight into wealth and purpose. Marin still rose before dawn to feed animals with clouded eyes and stiff joints. She still mended her own fences, still hauled her own water in winters when the well ran uncertain, still spoke to her husband's grave some evenings the way she always had, telling him about the horses, about the weather, about the strange turn her life had taken since a stranger died in her arms in the fog. She hired her first employee that autumn, a lean, quiet young man named Cole who had grown up on a ranch 2 counties over and lost it to the same kind of bank pressure that had once taken half of Marin's own land. And watching him learn the particular gentleness required to lead a blind horse to water, Marin felt something settle in her that she had not expected to feel again. The specific satisfaction of teaching someone else to carry work she had once believed only she could carry. What changed, quietly, was the reach of what she could do. The trust's resources, directed now by a woman who had spent her whole adult life doing exactly this kind of work for free, began flowing toward exactly the kind of forgotten, unglamorous places that had always fallen outside the interest of investors like Iris Calloway: small sanctuaries, aging ranch hands with no retirement, working families one bad season away from losing land that had been theirs for generations. Marin approved each grant personally, in her own kitchen, at her own table, with none of the ceremony the trust's former board might have insisted on. She visited her father's grave that spring for the first time in over a decade, standing over stone she had avoided since his funeral, and told him, finally, what she had learned: that the debts he carried in his final working years had been quietly eased by a stranger who wanted nothing, and that the same stranger had, decades later, died in her own arms without either of them knowing the thread connecting them, and that she wished, more than anything, that she had found some way to forgive him before he died instead of after, so that he might have known the shape of the mercy that had followed their family across 30 years without either of them ever seeing its face. She did not cry at the grave. She had done most of her crying, she found, in the months before, sitting under the oak tree with Ranger's head against her shoulder and two graves keeping her company in the quiet. What she felt at her father's grave instead was something quieter and harder to name, a kind of settling, an old wound closing not because the pain had disappeared, but because she finally understood enough of the whole shape of it to stop picking at the edges. Ranger lived another 4 years on her land, blind and slow and utterly beloved, standing sentinel over the oak tree until the day he, too, was laid to rest beneath it, completing a small strange circle of graves that Marin visited every evening of her life afterward, tending the ground the way she tended everything else she had ever been given, without asking whether she deserved it, simply because it was hers to care for now. The trust that Alden Whitfield built in secret, and that Marin inherited by accident of compassion rather than design, still operates today across 3 states, quietly funding the kind of unglamorous, unphotographed rural work that never makes headlines and was never meant to. Its charter, amended in the year following that first difficult board vote, contains a single line that every new administrator is asked to read before taking their post, a line taken directly from the last page of a dying man's journal. True nobility is not found in the titles we carry, but in the undeserved respect we offer to those who can give us nothing in return. Somewhere in Montana, fog still comes down off the ridge most October nights, settling low into the hollows the way it always has, patient and indifferent to whatever it might be covering. Visitors to the sanctuary sometimes ask about the 3 graves beneath the oak, and Marin answers them the same way every time, without embellishment, the way she has always told the truth when it mattered: a husband, a stranger who was not a stranger, and a horse who taught her that loyalty asks for nothing and gives everything anyway. And beneath an old oak tree that has now stood watch over 3 graves instead of 1, the ground remains quiet, the way ground does when everything that needed saying has finally been said.